Oxygen drops to 1/3, the body begins to die, and still every year, hundreds crowd into the death zone, chasing what most called impossible. More than 330 people have never come back from Everest alone. K2 takes 1 in 4. Why do climbers push higher as danger only grows? The answer begins where ambition first collided with the mountains. In the middle of the 19th century, Europe's highest peaks stood as unmapped frontiers. The so-called Golden Age of Alpinism began in 1854, when a handful of British and Swiss climbers set out to reach summits that had never been touched. Their equipment was basic: woolen jackets, nailed boots, hemp ropes, and wooden ice axes. There were no weather forecasts, no radios, no rescue plans. Each ascent was a gamble with forces barely understood. Edward Whymper, a young English artist, became obsessed with the Matterhorn, a jagged pyramid rising over 4,400 meters above the Swiss-Italian border. For years, the mountain had repelled every attempt. In July 1865, Whymper's party reached the summit, only to face disaster on the descent. 4 climbers fell to their deaths, their ropes snapping above an abyss. The Matterhorn was conquered, but at a price that haunted the climbing world for decades. These early expeditions were not about sport or personal achievement. Mountains were blank spaces on the map, and climbing them was an act of exploration. Teams would spend weeks or months on a single peak, ferrying loads up from remote valleys, building camps as they advanced. The cost was high. Frostbite, illness, and fatal accidents were common. Yet each summit reached meant a new line drawn on the world's charts. By the early 20th century, the focus shifted far beyond the Alps. The Himalaya and Karakoram, home to all 14 peaks above 8,000 meters, became the new arena. Expeditions to Mount Everest began as early as 1921, but the summit remained out of reach for decades. Gear was still primitive by modern standards. Climbers faced storms and avalanches with little more than canvas tents and hope. Everything changed in 1953. Edmund Hillary, a beekeeper from New Zealand, and Tenzing Norgay, a Sherpa from Nepal, stood on the summit of Everest after a grueling, month-long siege led by John Hunt. They used supplemental oxygen, but every step above 8,000 meters was a fight for breath. The following year, an Italian team led by Achille Compagnoni and Lino Lacedelli reached the top of K2, widely considered the most dangerous of all high mountains. These victories were national triumphs, requiring hundreds of porters, elaborate logistics, and unwavering discipline. Yet even as these first ascents made headlines, some climbers began to question the siege mentality. The next generation would look for a different way up, lighter, faster, and more exposed to risk. The modern era of high-altitude climbing is defined by numbers that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Each spring, more than 800 people may attempt to stand on the summit of Everest. Improved gear, satellite phones, and pinpoint weather forecasts have opened the world's highest peaks to a global audience. Helicopters now fly above 6,000 meters, able to pluck injured climbers from slopes that once guaranteed a slow end. Yet the mountains themselves have not changed. Above 8,000 meters, the so-called death zone, the air holds only a third of the oxygen found at sea level. The human body cannot adapt to this altitude. It can only endure it, and only for a matter of hours. The growing crowds bring new dangers. On Everest's southeast ridge, climbers have waited in line for hours at elevations higher than any point in North America. Bottlenecks form at fixed ropes and narrow passages, leaving dozens exposed to the cold while oxygen tanks run dry. In May 2019, a single weather window forced hundreds into a narrow corridor, creating a traffic jam above 8,500 meters. 11 climbers died that season, some from exhaustion, others from mistakes made in the thin air while waiting their turn. Other peaks are less forgiving. On K2, the world's second highest mountain, the fatality to summit ratio stands at 1 in 4. Unlike Everest, K2 offers no easy retreat. A single misstep or a broken anchor can mean disaster for everyone above. Annapurna, Another 8,000-meter giant has claimed the lives of more than 70 climbers since the 1950s, often because of avalanches triggered by congestion or delays. Behind every summit photo is an army of labor. Most modern climbers rely on a workforce of high-altitude Sherpa guides and porters. These men and women carry loads, fix ropes, and set camps, often making multiple trips through the most dangerous sections. In 2014, tragedy struck when an avalanche in the Khumbu icefall killed 16 Sherpa workers in a single morning. The aftermath saw protests and strikes as families demanded safer conditions and better compensation. For many, guiding is both a source of pride and a risk accepted out of economic necessity. The cost of a single Everest permit can exceed $11,000, yet the average Sherpa earns a fraction of that for a season of peril. Technology has changed who can climb, but not the risk they face. Since 1953, more than 330 climbers have died on Everest alone. The numbers tell a simple story. Access is easier, but immunity is an illusion. Crowds, commerce, and transferred risk have redrawn the map of danger, leaving the limits of survival as sharp as ever. At 8,000 meters, the rules of physiology are rewritten. The air contains just a third of the oxygen found at sea level. With each breath, the body falls further behind. Muscles waste away even during rest. Above 7,500 meters, climbers lose strength hour by hour as their bodies cannibalize tissue just to keep organs working. Judgment dulls, reaction time slow, and the simplest tasks, clipping a carabiner or tying a knot, become tests of will. Dr. Peter Hackett, a leading authority on altitude medicine, describes it plainly. Above 8,000 meters, the body is in a process of deterioration from the moment it arrives. There is no adaptation, only endurance. Blood thickens, increasing the risk of clots and stroke. The brain can swell, leading to confusion, hallucinations, and sometimes coma. High-altitude cerebral edema can strike without warning, turning a strong climber into a casualty in minutes. Survival in the death zone is measured in hours, not days. Without supplemental oxygen, the body's reserves drain quickly. Decision-making unravels. A misstep, a forgotten glove, or a delayed descent can end a life. Even with oxygen, the margin for error is razor thin. Above this invisible wall, human presence is temporary. No one stays long, not by choice. The summit is never a place to linger. Every moment spent at this altitude is borrowed time, and the bill is always due. Glaciers that once defined the high Himalaya are shrinking at a pace that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. Since the turn of the century, more than 10,000 glaciers across these ranges have lost 40 billion tons of ice. The Khumbu Glacier, lifeline of Everest's southern approach, has retreated over kilometers since the 1950s. On Annapurna and K2, thinning ice exposes loose rock, turning once reliable snowfields into dangerous slopes. Rockfall events above 6,000 meters, once rare, now happen dozens of times each season. In 2021, climbers on Everest's western Khum reported a surge of ice avalanches and stonefall, forcing route changes mid-expedition. Climbing seasons are shifting too. The stable weather windows that once lasted weeks now shrink to a handful of days. In 2023, only 6 days offered safe passage to Everest summit. Jet stream shifts bring sudden storms and higher winds, compressing hundreds of climbers into narrow time frames and amplifying the risks of crowding. The changes ripple far beyond the slopes. Downstream, nearly 2 billion people depend on Himalayan meltwater for farming, drinking, and power. In the Indus Basin, 60% of dry season flow comes from glacial melt. As ice reserves dwindle, communities face both floods from glacial lake bursts and droughts when rivers run dry. What lies ahead is uncertain. Some peaks may become unclimbable as hazards multiply and windows close. Others may see only the most skilled attempt their slopes, while technology and forecasting push the boundaries ever higher. For both climbers and those living in the valleys below, the fate of the mountains is tied to choices made far beyond their shadows. Today, every summit attempt unfolds on mountains destabilized by a warming climate, where risk is growing, not shrinking. What we decide now, at altitude and at home,